Welcome students to our next class on peasant movements in India. Obviously, I had mentioned that these three groups, working class or trade unions, peasant organizations and business groups, they play a very important role in Indian politics as pressure groups because their main objective is to influence the governmental decisions and get benefits out of it. Obviously, they have different techniques to influence the government policies, and the main technique is that these groups function as vote banks. So that we need to keep in mind while we are preparing peasant organizations in Indian politics, peasant movements in Indian politics since independence. This lecture is going to be divided under three heads. One, we are discussing in the first part, we are going to discuss peasant movements after independence, right? In the second part, we are going to discuss the rise of new farmers movement. What is this new farmers movement? And what is the distinction between peasant movement and new farmers movement, and how does it influence Indian government and politics? So this is the second part. And third part is basically the impact of globalization or market economy on peasant movement. In my last class on trade unionism, I have already mentioned that how globalization is impacting trade unionism. And I have discussed about the role of market, choice, competition, profit, about the role of skilled, labor replacing manual, and about the emergence of ICT, that is information and communication technology, in changing our lives. So what you need to keep in mind that these factors become relevant for this discussion also, because these factors are also going to impact the peasant movement after 1990s. Obviously, we are going to discuss few more factors in the last part, that is the impact of globalization on peasant movements. So let's start with the first part of our lecture, peasant movements in Indian politics. How do we look at it? Basically, if you ask me, I'll tell you that the term peasant is not a homogeneous category. It's the same with the working class, but it becomes more relevant with the peasant organization or peasant movement. The term peasant is not a homogenized category. It is very much, or unitary category, it is very much differentiated by caste, by class, and by regional factors. So mobilizing peasants through organizations is much more difficult task than mobilizing working class through trade unionism. Even Marxism and Leninism, by now you are quite well versed in leftist politics. You know the ideology of leftist political parties, especially CPI and CPM. Even the Marxist ideology has given more importance to the working class, but in the context of India, it is WPP, working class, and peasant parties. Okay, so for me, if you ask me, it is very difficult to define the term peasant because it's not a unitary category. There are multiple points of differences. There are multiple points of divisions that you need to keep in mind. Okay, while discussing the role of peasant movements in Indian politics, I personally feel that we can follow three approaches. One, spontaneous approach. Second, Marxist approach. And third, communist approach. What is this spontaneous approach? Spontaneous approach was much more valid in pre-independence era, where peasant movements were much more spontaneous, based on their spontaneous emotions. It was not that organized, and it was a kind of revolt against their landlords. So it was very spontaneous, not that organized. So this can be called as spontaneous approach, which is mainly valid for pre-independence peasant movements. But if you look at Marxist approach and communist approach, these two approaches are basically valid for post-independence peasant movements. Why? For three important factors. One, ideology. Second, organization. Third, the point of social transformation. So I personally feel that this Marxist approach and this communist approach, these two approaches can be well utilized in peasant movements in post-independence India. So that you need to keep in mind, and I don't need to explain what is Marxist approach and what is communist approach in case of peasant movements, because that I have already done in my last classes. Okay. So after independence, what we need to understand that the role of All India Kisan Sabha, that was very important in organizing the peasants. And needless to mention, the role of the communist parties, especially Communist Party of India, CPM, it was very significant in organizing the peasants to fight for their rights, to generate the class consciousness within the peasant movements, and at the same time to raise their demands for sharecrops, for their land rights, etc. You need to keep in mind that India is an agricultural country. So politicization of the land rights, politicization over resource distribution, all these things have always been important in our politics, in our context. So the role of All India Kisan Sabha and the role of provincial Kisan Sabhas of the communist parties, this has been very significant in mobilizing, in politicizing peasant issues. That you need to keep in mind. The independent India has seen different types of peasant movements. The very significant one is Tebhaga movement in West Bengal, then Telangana movement in Andhra Pradesh. What is very significant about these movements? The significant about this movement is the rise of their demands and voice by peasants, and basically it was related to their demand for sharecrops from their landlords. So Tebhaga and Telangana peasant movements was not only important for the politicization of their demand, but it was also important for another important thing, that was state violence. These two peasant movements were oppressed by the state, by the government. So violence and movement, these two things are interrelated, that you need to keep in mind. In your references, you have detailed discussion on Telangana and Tebhaga in West Bengal and in Andhra Pradesh, that you have to prepare, that specifically these movements that I am mentioning. And another important movement which we all would like to categorize as radical peasant movement is Naxalbari movement in West Bengal. Naxalbari movement, so far, if you have studied CPM, the ideology of CPM and CPI and CPM and other leftist political parties, Naxalbari movement is quite known to you now. This movement has become very significant. Not only that, in this movement, the peasant had raised their demands for sharecrops, but basically, in this movement, they wanted to alter the land relations. They wanted to attack the state. They wanted to demolish the state structures. So that is the reason this movement is considered to be radical peasant movement, not only because of its component violence, but because of the radical component that was embedded in the movement. Needless to mention that this movement was also suppressed by the government brutally, but from 1967 and till 70s, this era in West Bengal is known for this radical peasant movement known as Naxalbari movement in the Darjeeling district of West Bengal. And what you need to keep in mind, that all these peasant movements had highlighted the role of peasant organizations, All India Kisan Sabha, in Indian politics in terms of mobilization, in terms of ideology. So that you need to keep in mind. So post-independence India saw this kind of rise of peasant movements. Last point for this lecture, for your understanding, is peasant mobilization by the West Bengal government through Operation Varga. That also I have mentioned. What is this Operation Varga? Land to the landless. So that is very, very important. This movement was basically guided and sponsored by the government. So in peasant mobilization in India, especially in West Bengal, three important dimensions need to be mentioned. One, Telangana. Second, Telangana movement. Second, Tevaga movement. Another movement, radical peasant movement through Naxalbari movement, and another important peasant mobilization through Operation Varga by the government's mobilization. So four dimensions you have to mention. Okay. So now, after this peasant mobilization, where the role of All India Kisan Sabha was very significant under communist leadership, another important dimension is rich farmers movement. What is this rich farmers movement? First, I would like to mention that the rich farmers movement started emerging after 1970s. The term rich farmers movement or the rich farmer, needless to mention, is very different from the term peasant. So what is the main difference? You can understand. The main difference lies in two important points. One, in the holdings of land, and second, in terms of accumulation of capital. So according to Rudolph and Rudolph, these rich farmers can also be called as bullock capitalists because they have basically the 0.5 to 15 acres of land in their accumulation. So that is very, very important. These rich farmers are not only investing money in agriculture, they have so much capital that they can also diversify their investment in industrialization. And another important point that segregates rich farmer from peasant is basically their power to employ these rural poor peasants as wage laborers. So what is here important is the land holding, capital accumulation, and the power of the rich farmers in employing the poor peasants as wage laborers. So what is this rich farmers movement? Rich farmers movement basically to a large extent is a product of Green Revolution. We all know that Green Revolution changed the fate of the rich farmers because it had introduced technology in agriculture and demand for capital investment in agriculture. Those farmers who could do it became the rich industrialist, bullock capitalist or farmers. So this is the main point that you need to keep in mind. That's why in the beginning I mentioned that the term peasant is not homogeneous, it's not unitary, and it's not all inclusive because the rich farmers are now very much segregated and going out of this tag of peasants. Number one. Number two, what is this rich farmers movement? Why, I mean, if they're rich, why do they need movement? They need movement not for demand, not for their rights in sharecrops, not for their rights in land. They need movement for more electricity from the government, for more land at cheaper rates from the government, for more subsidy for industrialization and agricultural development from the government. So what I'm trying to tell you that not only that the peasant category is very much diversified, even the demands of the peasants and the demands of the rich farmers, these are very, very different that you need to keep in mind. Okay, so rich farmers movement basically was mobilized under the Bharatiya Kisan Union. Bharatiya Kisan Union, again, it's a union for rich farmers, very much different from AIKS, All India Kisan Sabha. So this organization is different in terms of their class composition, in terms of their interest mobilization, in terms of their outlook. It means their orientation to the ideology of communism. So rich farmers movement is very much different from the term peasant. Not only BKU, Shetkari Shangatana in Maharashtra is also another example for mobilizing the rich farmers' interests. So what you need to keep in mind that rich farmers movement is very much different from the peasant movement in terms of their class and interest. So this movement was very much product of Green Revolution that actually induced the demand for more technology and capital in agriculture and automatically added a class component within the peasant and made it very much diverse. So what you need to keep in mind that peasant movement in India is not at all unitary. It's very diverse because the contribution of the communist leadership is very much different from this rich farmers movement. So that you need to keep in mind. So 3 important points through this lecture we have discussed. One, in the beginning I have mentioned peasant community is not a unified community. Why? Just now I have explained. Second, I have mentioned 2 important approaches can be utilized to understand peasant movement after independence. One, spontaneous approach which was mainly valid before independence because of the spontaneity element in the mobilization, no organization. And 2 other approaches, Marxist and communist approach and leadership, because it had played the most significant role in mobilizing the peasants in India, especially in West Bengal. And then the role of AIKS, All India Kisan Sabha. While you are preparing through your notes, also prepare the role, the time, the objectives of All India Kisan Sabha. It is very much related what I am telling you at this moment. Then I have mentioned Tebhaga movement, Telangana movement, Naxalbari movement and Operation Varga movement. All these movements highlight the role of Marxist ideology, mobilization of the peasants and communist leadership. And another important point that we need to keep in mind is state oppression and violence. Within these movements, Naxalbari movement was not only known for its violence and radical politics, but also brutality faced by the activists, and the scope of the movement, it was much more greater than the previous movements. And then we have come to the last part of our lecture, that is the rise of new farmers movements since 1970s. The main background is the background of Green Revolution, and I have already mentioned that why this movement, new farmers movement, is different from the peasant movement in terms of land holdings, accumulation, class composition, and the role of BKU, Bharatiya Kisan Union, to mobilize the separate interests of the rich farmers. So far this is the peasant movement in independence, after independence in post-colonial India. Please go through this. Next part of the lecture is going to discuss the impact of globalization on the peasant movements in India. Thank you. Stay safe.